Today we're talking about one of history's greatest supporting actors. A guy who was arguably ahead of Martin Luther in starting the Reformation, but he ended up being kind of a historical footnote. Meet Ulrich Zwingli, the Swiss reformer who proved that sometimes being first doesn't make you famous, and that theological debates can get surprisingly heated when they involve bread and wine. History, or I should say the reporting of it, has a penchant for identifying one person, a singular standout as the locus of change, and telling the story from that one perspective, despite the fact that there were others who participated in or even maybe paralleled that change. And such is the case with Martin Luther and the Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli. While Luther is the historic bookmark for sparking the Reformation, you'd have to say in some ways Zwingli was ahead of him. Born in Switzerland in 1484, Ulrich Zwingli was educated in the best universities and ordained as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. A keen mind applied to intense theological inquiry, challenged by a spiritual struggle, all of that brought him to a genuine faith in Christ in 1516, a year before Luther tacked his 95 items for discussion to Wittenberg's castle church door. 2 years later, Zwingli arrived in Zurich, where he spent the rest of his life. By 1523, he was leading the Reformation in Switzerland. Zwingli's preaching convinced Zurich's city council to permit clergy to marry. They abolished the Mass and banned images and statues in public worship. They closed monasteries and, they severed ties with Rome. Recognizing the central place the Bible was to have in the Christian life, the Zurich reformers published the New Testament in their own vernacular in 1524, and the entire Bible 6 years later, 4 years before Luther's German translation was available. Now, Zwingli didn't just preach a Reformation message, he lived it. He married Anna Reinhard in 1522. In one important respect, Zwingli followed the Bible more specifically than Luther. Martin allowed whatever the Bible did not prohibit. Zwingli rejected whatever the Bible did not prescribe. So the Reformation in Zurich tended to, strip away more traditional symbols of the Roman Church. Things like lighting candles as an act of piety, the use of statues and pictures as objects of devotion. Even church music was ended. Later in England, some of these reforms would come to be called Puritanism. But more than the application of Reformation principles, Zwingli's bookmark in history is pegged to the Eucharistic controversy that his teaching stirred. He was at the center of a major theological debate concerning the Lord's table. Between 1525 and 1528, a bitter war of words was waged between Zwingli and Luther. During this debate, Luther would write a tract and Zwingli would reply. Then Zwingli would pen a treatise and Luther would reply. This went back and forth for 3 years. It was a war that was fought with pamphlets as the ammunition. Now, both sides rejected the Roman doctrine of transubstantiation. That's that the prayer of a duly authorized Roman priest transformed the elements into the literal body and blood of Christ. Their disagreement centered on Jesus' words when he said, "This is my body." You see, Luther and his followers adopted the position known as consubstantiation, which says that Jesus is present in, with, and under the elements, and that taking communion spiritually strengthens the believer. Zwingli and his supporters regarded this as an unnecessary compromise with the doctrine of transubstantiation. They said that Jesus' words had to be understood symbolically. The elements represented Jesus' blood and body, and communion was merely a memorial. An important memorial, to be sure, but the bread and wine were meant to be understood by Jesus as symbols of his body and his blood. That debate remains to this day among the children of the Reformation, the Protestants, and it can be as heated as the exchanges between its original proponents, Luther and Zwingli. It should be noted that during the last years, Zwingli seems to have moved to a new position in regard to communion. He came to recognize a spiritual presence of Christ in the elements. Though reducing the idea to words, I have to say that's a proposition beyond my limited capacity. This later position of Zwingli was the position of Philip Melanchthon, you'll remember was Luther's assistant and spiritual heir. Now, my take on all of this is that though Zwingli could not go along with Luther's consubstantiation, he yearned to see the Protestants united in the face of growing Roman Catholic hostility. Since much of political Europe was firmly in the Roman Church's grip, Zwingli could see that if Protestants didn't unite, they'd be easy pickings. You may remember that at the Marburg Colloquy, Lutheran and Swiss reformers met to attempt a union. They agreed on every point of the Reformation except the Lord's Supper. Melanchthon seems to have acted as a mediator between Luther and Zwingli until Luther yanked Melanchthon's chain and told him, "You better stay in line." After Luther was out of the picture and the reins of the Lutheran movement fell to Melanchthon, I suspect that Zwingli saw a more ready partner at the same time that the hostility he feared was beginning to rain down on the Protestants. So Zwingli moved a little closer towards the basic idea of Lutheran consubstantiation. Following hundreds of years of tradition, Zwingli, along with many other reformers, believed that the state and the church should reinforce one another in the work of God. There should be no separation. That's why the Reformation became increasingly political and split Switzerland into Catholic and Protestant cantons, and eventually saw all of Europe carved up into differing religious regions. The terrible wars of religion that are coming up soon in our series were the result of that. Now, Switzerland at that time was a network of 13 regions called cantons, loosely federated and basically democratic. So think American states or maybe German Bundelands. Now, culturally, the north and the east were German, the west was French, and the south, of course, was Italian. The Reformation spread from Zurich, chief Swiss city of the capital canton, to the rest of German Switzerland, who were nevertheless reluctant to come under the political control of Zurich. Several cantons remained militantly Roman Catholic and resisted Zwingli's influence, mostly for economic reasons. As political tensions grew, several Protestant cantons formed what was called the Christian Civic League. Feeling threatened, Catholic cantons organized and allied themselves with the King of Austria. A desire to avoid war led to the first Peace of Kappel in 1529, but as often happens, once a treaty was hammered out, the only option left was war. Sure enough, 2 years later, 5 Roman Catholic cantons attacked an unprepared Zurich. Zwingli fought as a common soldier in the Battle of Kappel in 1531, and he died on the field. The second Peace of Kappel, hammered out at the end of the year, prohibited further spread of the Reformation in Switzerland. Heinrich Bullinger, Zwingli's son-in-law, took over the leadership of the Protestant cause in Zurich and enjoyed great influence across Europe. An important aspect of Zwingli's impact on the Reformation was that he cast it along civic lines with a view to establishing a model Christian community. He persuaded the city council to legislate various details of the Reformation. He aimed at political reform as well as spiritual regeneration. The inter-canton struggles of this period led to the growing independence of the city of Geneva, which became the home of John Calvin, another great Reformation luminary that we'll be looking at soon. The Swiss Reformation and Zwinglian movement ended up merging with Calvinism later in the 16th century. Now, one of the things the Roman Church warned the Protestants about was that if they left the mother church, they would start a fracture that would have no end. If they broke with Rome, where would the breakage end? If people were free to start their own churches, then, people were free to start their own churches. Protestants might leave the Roman Church, but how long before others left them to start their own movements? Like a crack in the windshield that starts small, it spreads and branches until the window is in ruins. Well, that's pretty much what happened over the decades that followed Luther and Zwingli. We're going to take a look at what are called the radical reformers in our next episode.